The first thing I saw when I arrived at the asylum center was that most of the asylum seekers were from the Caucasus. I was invited to give an interview detailing why I am seeking political asylum. I was surprised by the questions they asked me. It seemed to me that they didn't know the reality in Moldova, and on the other side, most EU states declared Moldova as a successful country. What I stated during the interview in 2010 was 90% proven later. During my stay in a refugee center, I learned more about the culture and traditions of the Caucasus. The pleasant surprise was Georgians. We created a friendship between us, we shared experience with each other. I heard all kinds of interesting stories. A true case of a refugee I will probably never forget. At that time, when Mikhail Saakashvili was in charge of Georgia, all the EU leaders who knew who Saakashvili was and who said that human rights were not respected in Georgia and that Saakashvili was a dictator had no chance to get refugee status, so some refugees had to adapt. Many Georgians started to say they were of a different sexual orientation, and for a very short time, they started to receive documents, but after they got refugee status, those who said they were of a different sexual orientation married with women. Most who came from Georgia were instructed by friends what to say at the interview. The Dutch authorities have started to send gay Dutch people to interviews with Georgians who declare that they are of a different orientation. A Georgian who didn't know about the new Dutch tactics was taken by surprise when a Dutchman tried to kiss him. The Georgian was a judo fighter, and Georgia is a very religious Orthodox Christian country. The Georgian just wanted to get refugee status but was not prepared for someone to try to kiss him. This Georgian used judo techniques and broke some ribs on the gay Dutchman. The Georgian was deported to Georgia. But that Georgian in the Polish refugee campus tells me that this Georgian didn't do it right. I was thinking too much, and what could he do? I'm still Orthodox Christian and I practiced Taekwondo, and if some man tried to kiss me I'd probably punch him a few times. The Georgian continued, he should have said that I don't want to cheat on my boyfriend who is in Georgia. After reading this text, some might say it's bizarre. This situation can only be understood by another refugee. Because when you ask for protection, you are put in the situation to lie, the authorities require you to lie. Because otherwise you are still in a situation of being deported, and some of the people sold their house, car, to pay the ticket to get to the EU. A ticket cost very expensive at that time because in most cases you had to go illegally, and even if you have proof, most countries don't want to give you refugee status because they don't want to conflict with the country of origin. State interests dominate over human rights. In my case, I had plenty of evidence, videos, pictures, and subpoena from the Attorney General. But according to their logic, you have not suffered enough. You had to stay about 3 to 4 years in jail to be destroyed in prison, to get sick with all the diseases, and then to come and ask for asylum. Then what is the role of the asylum, because you are already a broken person? In the temporary center in Biala Podlaska I stayed in a room with a Cuban citizen. We had many things in common. We both hated communist regimes. I heard all kinds of stories about Castro that sounded terrible. We had problems with part of the Caucasian, Muslim, population. Biala Podlaska was a temporary center for asylum seekers, and the friends we knew were assigned to other centers. We asked for help from the authorities, but they replied that they were not responsible for the relationships between the refugees. We both knew how to fight, but the Caucasian Muslims were more numerous and they never came alone. I was the only person who spoke English and we were usually together. He had black skin color and usually had a lot of problems when he was alone because of the Poles who were racist, and on the other hand there were also Caucasian Muslims. Cuban, Mauricio Gonzalez was attacked one night in a club in Biala Podlaska by border police. By people who are supposed to protect him. Forced to defend, Mauricio used the knife. He seriously injured 2 people. after which he was locked up in prison and released after a few months. About this event was also written in the newspapers. Across the street from the house where Mauricio was staying was the club. From the window of the room where he was staying, you could see the club, and I was sitting in the neighboring house. I only saw when the police came because I was not that night in the club. Poles have a negative attitude towards migrants. They hate migrants. It was easier for me, because I was European, but when you went with the temporary document you immediately felt the hatred of the Poles. Because of Polish racism, the Cuban always carried a knife. Chechens, who were considered to be the friendliest, the ones who caused problems, were the ones from Ingushetia and Dagestan. Ingushes and Chechens speak the same language but are different in character. Or that the Americans and the British. I could say that they are the same as Romanians and Moldovans. They speak the same language but have different characters. After this case, I decided to go to Germany, although, according to the law, I was forbidden to leave Poland until I had been given a final answer. Once in Germany, I went to a police station and applied for asylum. From Biala Podlaska to Szczecin I took several coaches. Usually those who wanted to get to Germany, took the transport from Lublin, and most of them were arrested right in Lublin. From Szczecin I took a taxi to Lögnitz. In Lögnitz the police station was closed and I took another taxi to Pasewalk, Germany. At the police station I asked for asylum. I presented all the documents and the police behaved quite well. The immigration people came. And they behaved very well until they found out my ethnicity. Since they found out my ethnicity, everything changed radically. Then they locked me in a room. I didn't sleep for 2 days because I was on the road, and the third day when I tried to sleep, they would come in every 30 minutes all night and check the room, even though there was a camera in that room, and if they saw that I was sleeping, they would pull the iron door so hard that I would wake up. In the room where I was locked there was also a sound like rain and thunder outside. I was so surprised when I went out the next day to be taken to court, to see that it hadn't rained at all that night. It was a sound they probably put on so I wouldn't sleep. I was taken to court the next day. I couldn't even say 2 words because I was so tired, and when the judgment is over, I woke up with handcuffs on my hands. It was the first time I was locked up in prison. It was a terrible feeling. I couldn't believe it. I was crying like a child. I escaped from the communists, but the Nazis locked me up. I was imprisoned in Germany for almost a month, during which time I met Georgian. Gotcha. He lifted my spirits. He immediately told me that we would not be imprisoned for more than a month. 2 months at the most, and then they would deport us to Poland. On that prison corridor was just me, a Georgian, and the rest of Vietnam. We were each in different rooms. Georgians are always positive and you always have to tell the stories as they enriched in Europe. Talking to a Georgian is a great pleasure. The Germans deported us both to Poland. In Poland we had a court again in the city of Szczecin. In Poland I decided to defend myself, but after I said everything, the Polish judge told the clerk to erase everything I said and write that I am not against to stay in prison, even if I spoke more than 30 minutes. I'm sure that even now this can be verified. It is enough to look at what time the judgment started and what time the judgment is over. When we arrived at a closed refugee center in Krasno-Odrzański, the other refugees knew we were coming for a few days, when me and the Georgian were still in Germany. The judge in Szczecin gave me 2 months to stay in prison. After I was in prison for 2 months, the Poles gave me another 3 months. The situation in this prison was as follows: they had no right to keep you more than a year in prison, but they didn't want to give you freedom either. The Poles kept the refugees in detention as long as possible, because for each refugee who was detained and deported, the Poles received a colossal amount of money from the European Union. 99.9% of refugees were deported. From 2008 to 2011 only 3 refugees were released, and those were people who Poland had no diplomatic relations with these countries. People who did not want to return to their country of origin were simply kept in detention for 11 months and 25 days, and when they had to be released in a few days, because the law no longer allowed them to keep them in detention, that refugee was woken up in the morning and deported. When I was locked up in prison, Krasno Odrzynsky, in the room where we were locked up, there were several inmates. All political immigrants. In the room there were about 18 people, among them I was Moldovan, 1 Russian, Belarusian, 2 Vietnamese and the rest Georgians. Georgians had relatives and friends everywhere, and one day one of them received a package from Holland with substances banned in Poland. In Holland such weed was legal, while in Poland it was banned. When the prison guards checked the parcel, this weed was found. They called him to the prosecutor's office to investigate who sent the Georgian the forbidden weed. The Georgian who received the weed was called Irakli Salakaya, and when questioned who sent him the weed, Irakli said, "Give me a sheet to write that Georgian names because are hard to pronounce." He wrote on a sheet the name of the Georgian from Holland. Who sent him the weed? The Polish prosecutor was happy that he had solved the case and that he would be promoted. Until another Pole came and read the name of the Georgian from Holland on the sheet. And he asks him, "Do you know who this Georgian is that he wrote on your sheet?" "Who?" "This Mikhail Saakashvili is the president of Georgia." And this Pole, who thinks he's smarter than the other Pole, asks the Georgian, "How could Mikhail Saakashvili send you weed if he's in Georgia now?" To which the Georgian replies, "Mikhail Saakashvili is in Georgia but his wife is Dutch." When Irakli told us this story, we all died laughing. I have written the real name of this Georgian, so that he can confirm everything I have said about the illegalities committed by the Poles. I wrote a request for those from the International Migration Organization to be deported to Belarus, because in Moldova I could not return. My request has been accepted. In total, I was imprisoned in Poland for 3 months. When the Poles deported me to Belarus, the Poles asked me, "Why are you deported to Belarus?" And I answered, "Yes, why didn't you give me refugee status? Why did you put me in prison for another 3 months without me attending the court? Without giving me a lawyer? Without giving me an interpreter? I had to choose, to stay in prison for 11 months and 25 days and then to be deported from Poland to Moldova, or to be deported to Belarus. From Poland to Belarus I was deported by plane. The Polish authorities have also asked the Polish embassy if I can be deported to Belarus, and the Belarusian authorities accepted. Now I'm thinking, why the Poles didn't give me refugee status and sent me to Belarus to Lukashenko's dictatorial regime? There's only one explanation. It's what the Romanians did to me later. On the one hand, the Romanians did not want me to live in a NATO and European Union member country, and they did everything possible for me to return to Romania, but as soon as I arrived in Romania, they made my life unbearable in Romania so that I could leave Romania for Moldova, and Moldova was ruled by pro-Russians. The Poles wanted me to end up in the hands of the Russians, to work for the Russians. Obviously, after going through all this humiliation in Poland, the Poles hoped that I would be let down by the European Union and NATO and start working for the Russians, or be destroyed by Lukashenko's or Putin's regime. About this I understood only in 2017. When you're locked up in prison, every cent is counted, everything you hold precious is written in documents, and I had very little money, and the Poles knew this, and yet they deported me to Belarus. There were only possibilities to survive in Belarus. 1. To work in Belarus. 2. To be destroyed by Lukashenko's regime.